Good morning, everybody. Last week, we focused on the interwar period, right? The rise of Hitler and Mussolini and expansionism in Japan. And we talked about expansionist foreign policy. This week, what you're going to see with these kind of two lectures and one video clip this week is going to be a little bit different in that you'll still have the traditional lecture that we record to YouTube, but this is going to be updated into what's called Ed Puzzle. So you'll still get the same lecture, but at various points within this lecture, it's going to pause and it's going to ask you a question. This question might be short answer, this question might be multiple choice, and this is an opportunity for us to check for understanding and see how far along in the lectures that you're getting. At this stage of the game, right, answer the questions thoughtfully, and you get completion grades for getting through the lectures and answering these questions with thoughtful responses. Okay, so this week, our focus is going to be looking at the Holocaust. So we know kind of what, from last week, what Hitler's expansionist foreign policy looked like. We know what his kind of master race program kind of was taking shape as by targeting the Jews as a scapegoat. And so today and into this week, we're going to be focusing on the Holocaust itself. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen with you. And today's lecture is going to be looking at what's called the 8 stages of genocide. Okay, so an organization called Genocide Watch put together these 8 stages of genocide a number of years ago, looking at genocides post-World War II and how to identify them and then prevent them in the future. So today our focus is going to be on looking at the stages themselves, not as much the prevention piece that will come later in Unit 3 likely, but today we're going to focus on just the stages themselves. So this was outlined by Dr. Greg Stanton in 1996. And we're going to go through each of the 8 stages. 6 of these stages are early warning signs, and then the final 2, the extermination and then the denial. So we're going to go through each of these here today. Stage 1 is this idea of classification, right? This is identifying us versus them, right? And in grade 10, you talked about the Rwandan genocide. So I've referenced it here throughout the presentation in addition to Germany. Okay, I've scaled back the volume of Rwanda though. Okay, so ultimately, stage 1, looking at classification, you're identifying people as different. This may be by nationality, ethnicity, race, religion, and so this classification is a way of dividing society and creating a power struggle between the two groups. And so if you recall from your study of Rwanda in grade 10, the Belgians believed that the Tutsis were more superior based on physical characteristics. Okay, so this was the Tutsis' way, the Belgian and the Tutsis and the Hutus in Rwanda. This was that form of classification. Stage 2, symbolization. Okay, this idea of physically identifying those classifications made in stage 1. Name calling, languages, types of dress, uniforms. And so what you see in Nazi Germany, right, is the swastika, identifying Nazis, and then using colors and religious symbols in order to identify Jews. Or gypsies, or any of the others that are targeted. And this is the Star of David that was most frequently used to identify Jews in Germany. Symbolization in Germany also looked at this idea of identification through a passport. And by 1938, all Jewish residents of Germany were required to carry, right, their citizenship was stripped, and they were required to carry this basically like a passport when they were, in the city or the town or whatever they were doing. And this was even prior to being forced to don the Star of David on their clothing. Right, later the Star of David becomes a very visible symbol worn by all Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe by 1941. So this is 2 years after the war starts. And this didn't matter if you were an adult or a child, you were forced to wear the symbols. Right, once the concentration camp system got up and running, there was an even more sophisticated symbolization program that took place, and you can see that depicted in the chart here. I know the words are quite small and written in German, but it defined you by perhaps religion, by perhaps gender orientation, and a whole host of other identification things, right? And so not only did this cause discrimination within societies itself, but also within the concentration camps by fellow inmates who may shun another group, for example, like homosexuals. Stage 3 is this idea of dehumanization. So when one group denies the humanity of another group, and this makes the group seem subhuman, right? That they are below the superior group. And oftentimes we're looking at dehumanization in Nazi Germany through the use of propaganda. And you can see the comparison here. This is Nazi Germany in newspapers, the way individuals are depicted. And then this is in 1994 in Rwanda, right? So propaganda plays a huge role, and we're going to be looking at propaganda kind of down the road as well, right? Looking at what's deemed as kind of the perfect Aryan in comparison to others. And hate propaganda is evident very early on in Nazi Germany, long before the war. Hate propaganda in speeches, newspapers, radios, right? And this is not specific to Nazi Germany itself during genocide, but all forms of genocide later down the road. But we're going to speak to Nazi Germany specifically today, right? Hitler, from the very beginning, is identifying an us versus them, and then further dehumanizing them throughout his kind of march to power and then march to war. Right, this idea of through propaganda and hate propaganda, identifying victim groups, in our case, the Jews, as vermin, as diseases, right? Trying to make them seem despicable, right? That they cannot, right? A disease is something that you need to treat right now, or it's just going to become infested in your community. And so Hitler treats the Jews as if they were a disease, like rats, like vermin. Right, invoking this idea of superiority of one of the Aryans over the Jews. Right? And ultimately speaking, this dehumanization, right, justifies murder by calling it ethnic cleansing or purification. And this is going to hide the horror of mass murder down the road, right? Justifying it to the people. You will have masses of people that believe it. You will have masses of people that go with it out of fear, right? Stage 4, we're looking at this idea of organization, right? We're now really marching down that path to genocide, right? Genocide isn't something that's conducted by one person, right? It is a group crime, right? The murder, in this case of the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews and 5 million others cannot be done by one person. It takes tremendous organization in order for it to occur. And in the case of Nazi Germany and many other genocides, right, it is the state that organizes it. It is the state that arms it. It is the state that financially supports the various groups that are going to be conducting the massacres, right? Now, the state isn't a requirement, but in many cases it is there. Essentially, plans are made by the leaders or the elites for this so-called final solution. In the Hitler's case, right, the mass genocide using concentration camps in order to execute mass numbers of people. Stage 5, we're looking at something called polarization. And right, all of these stages have to happen in sequence, okay? Because stage 5 is going to build on the division started in stages 1 and 2, and then further in 3 and 4. And so you've got this extension of the propaganda campaigns, right, through broadcasting, print polarization, various laws get passed. We're going to be talking about many of those laws in our next lecture, the factors that led to the Holocaust itself. But various laws being passed to forbid intermarriage, social integration, those types of things. Political moderates get silenced, right? That elimination of the opposition, right? So that could be threats, that could be intimidation, or that could be execution themselves, right? They must rid the society of opposition to what they're about to do. Public demonstrations, like public mass gatherings organized against Jewish merchants, mass boycotts. And if you, so a moderate German, so if you were a German who didn't necessarily believe in what was taking place, and you didn't kind of adhere to the party line, you too could be arrested for not fully supporting the program that was about to take place. So further with this idea of polarization, attacks are staged, and then they get blamed on the targeted groups. Right, we talked about Hitler coming to power with the Reichstag fire decree, right? We had mentioned that they had blamed it on the communists. Well, in extension to that, many believe they had convinced many that it was Jewish communists in 1933, right? So that further extension, that blaming of the event. Cultural centers get targeted and attacked. So you're looking at synagogues. So in 1938, an event called Kristallnacht takes place, where hundreds of Jewish synagogues across Germany get attacked and burned. Stage 6, this idea of preparation, right? And like I said, all of these events have to occur, right? Stages have to occur in order, some faster than others. And so you've got these identifying symbols, right, that people are already wearing. And now in the case of Nazi Germany, you have death lists being made, right? Identification of who the exact people are in the communities. And now there's a separation of groups. Okay, so you've got the death list, the victims get separated in many cases into ghettos and then later into concentration camps, or just straight from community to concentration camp because of, in the case of Nazi Germany, religious identity. In the case of Rwanda, ethnic identity. Right, so you've got segregation into ghettos in Nazi-occupied Holland. So specifically, sorry, Europe, not Holland. Nazis do occupy Holland, right? But the imposition of ghettos, so forcing individuals into ghettos and then concentration camps. And the video clip that you'll watch later next is going to talk about those ghettos and the volume of people crammed into these ghettos in Poland. And then, of course, you get deported then from the ghettos to concentration camps or famine-struck regions for later starvation or execution via the gas chambers later. They start in this preparation phase really stockpiling weapons, right, to murder 6 million Jews and 5 million others for a total of 11 million between 1941 and 1945. Think about the volume of weapons that are going to be needed, and those are going to need to be stockpiled at your killing centers. And ultimately speaking, there's a mass concentration camp system that gets set up in order for this to take place. At the peak of the Nazi concentration camp system, it's believed that there were between 44 and 45,000 concentration camps throughout Europe. Some of them killing centers like Auschwitz that you see on your screen. Some of them transit camps, like hubs that would be used to transit people through. Some of them work camps. And so you have a massive system that gets built over the course of a number of years, right? This preparation that goes in towards the ultimate case of genocide. Stage 7 is the actual execution, right? The stuff that we read about in our history books. Extermination begins. And as it becomes more significant in mass, it can be then labeled genocide. Genocide, though, it's never deemed a genocide, very rarely deemed a genocide during the action itself. Later down the road, it gets labeled a genocide. And one thing that we would be talking about in class, if we were sitting in class, would be why is the now in the case of Nazi Germany, the UN wasn't a thing yet, but in the case of Rwanda, Cambodia, or other 20th century genocides post World War II, why are governments and the United Nations so reluctant to identify these actions as genocides in the moment? Identifying something as a genocide means you have a moral responsibility to then take action. But a lot of governments in the United Nations does not have the capacity nor the will, for various national interest reasons, to take action. And that's another topic for another day. So the killing or the extermination occurs when you've got mass numbers, the preparation has taken place, and people are able to do this on the basis that, right, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people that are involved in the extermination process during the war. And they too have become desensitized to it and believing that the victims are not fully human, right? That they are cleansing society of vermin or cockroaches or disease from society, right? Justifying the action. And so you've got Rwanda on the right and Nazi Germany on the left. And you have to think about the volume of people needed, right? It is not only the state and officers of the state that are taking this into their hands to participate, right? It's often the work of local militias. In the case of Rwanda, we know this is the case. In Nazi Germany, it was the case a little bit. It was largely at the hands of the at the Nazis, but there were community helpers along the way, largely out of fear for their own lives. And our last stage is denial, right? This comes after the fact. Denial is found during and after, but largely after. And this idea of continued denial is one of the best indicators of further genocidal massacres, right? It extends the crime of genocide to future generations, right? A continuation of the intent to destroy this, this group. Okay, but the tactics of the denial are pretty predictable. Deny there was any mass killing at all, question and minimize the statistics, block access to archives and witness, intimidate or kill eyewitnesses, okay? Destroy the evidence, right? Burn the bodies, the archives, dig it all up, burn the mass graves. But in the case of the Holocaust, there are so many people that survived. Right? We have hundreds of thousands of witness testimony that they experienced this, right? Many of you were privy to a guest speaker before on our last day of class, before we got shut down due to COVID, right? We heard firsthand the horrors of the Holocaust from Abe Silverman, right, in our own library. And so, right, this becomes very difficult to deny, but there are Holocaust deniers out there. It attack the truth tellers, attack the motives of those telling the stories, point out atrocities committed by other people. And so ultimately speaking, right, this idea of denial is pretty significant. And one thing, right, it's impossible to deny the Holocaust, right? We have hundreds of thousands of survivors. We have concentration camps all over Europe that have been turned into museums and memorialized in remembrance of those who lost their lives in all of these camps, right? We have tremendous evidence. The Nazis themselves kept remarkable records of the atrocities that they'd committed, right? Books upon books upon books of birth date, death date, all of this, prisoner number, and more. And the volume is insurmountable and incomprehensible. Now, in Germany, it is illegal to deny the Holocaust. You can be arrested for doing that. In Canada, we have an example There are Holocaust deniers in Canada and all over the world, but the evidence is irrefutable that it did indeed happen. And many of you might go on to become teachers in Alberta, and there's a course that you have to take. It's called, Ethics of Teaching. And one of the case studies that you look at is an Alberta teacher who denied the Holocaust. And it was the introduction of diploma exams that this was found out, because kids started writing about this, and was later investigated. He later lost his teaching license because he wasn't teaching the curriculum, because he was teaching that the Holocaust didn't happen and there was a conspiracy. But the Holocaust did indeed happen, right? And we're going to get into later this week looking at the factors that led to this, what laws got passed along the way, and how did society react that enabled this to take place. So our next, where do you go from here, right? You've watched this one, you're now going to watch the Crash Course World History. I believe it's about 13 minutes in length. And it's going to give you some pictures, right? Some visual detail associated with this march to the Holocaust. And then we're going to follow that up with one last lecture this week, looking at the factors that led to the Holocaust. What transpired? How does a community go from, being neighbors to mass execution and that being acceptable? So we'll see you in a couple days, or maybe in a couple minutes, depending on how you structure your week. Have a great day, everybody.